So thank you for having us this evening. Be remiss if I didn't thank both Alex McGee and Lauren Costa, the town's new budget coordinator, as well as our treasurer, Julie Wayman, for her ongoing support in the preparation of this document for 26 that was transmitted to this esteemed committee on January 15th. So turn it over to Alex, who's going to just give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about tonight, and then a review of what the town's budget process looks like, as we understand there are a few new members of the committee this year.
All right, so quickly we'll talk about sort of the budget process tonight. We will do an overview of the FY26 proposed budget. We will note highlights that we want to sort of showcase, which includes maintaining the board's override commitments, and then sort of the investments that we propose making in response to community needs. And we'll take a look at the long-range plan, the sort of outlook, and then we'll talk about next steps. Quickly on the process, the budget is a lot of work by sort of a large-ish group of people over a long period of time throughout the year. I'm going to echo what Jim said, give thanks to Lauren Costa, Julie Wayman, and all of our department heads for all the work that they do in preparing their departmental budgets and the assistance that they give me and sort of the budget team on getting the final document process in line. As you all know, the fiscal year begins in July 1st. That's really when we start our budget season, sort of late July. Capital requests are due into the town manager's office in August. In October, November, operating budget requests are due on a rolling basis, and then we hold internal meetings with all of our department heads on a rolling basis to get those moved. And then by January, we have formulated our budget recommendation, and we deliver budget books to the select board and the finance committee. January through April is when all of you are doing all of your work. A lot of you have already started meeting with your departments, so nice job there. In March, the financial plan is usually developed and handed off to the select board and finance committee. April, the finance committee's report is submitted to town meeting. And then in April or May, depending on when it falls, the town meeting will adopt some form of operating capital budgets. In June, about a month later, the fiscal year ends, and then we start the process all over again. All right, we're going to hand it to Jim for a revenue review here.
So a brief review of what is projected for revenue. Of course, property taxes have and will continue to be our largest source of revenue, accounting for roughly 75% of our revenue. Of course, projected to grow by 2.5%. And for this year, we have assumed or budgeted $850,000 in new growth. We are fortunate for the past 5 years now that our new growth as a percentage of the prior year's levy limit has gone up each of the past 5 years, and we are now for the past 2 years over 1%, which is a big milestone for Arlington, though it may not be a big milestone for other communities in the Commonwealth. Local receipts are assumed to grow marginally. We have maintained what have been the historically conservative revenue assumptions, which include projecting motor vehicle excise tax to grow by $100,000. Otherwise, only some other minor revenue adjustments of note were made. So we did correct for some contractual building rental increases that resulted from some recent public RFP processes for both 17 Irving Street and 23 Maple Street that will generate a bit more rental revenue than they were in the fiscal year past. And we've also budgeted for a likely reduction at 85 Park Ave, which is the building occupied by ACMi. In all likelihood, with the support of the select board, knowing the financial predicament that ACMi is in, we will consider when it is due for an RFP for that building, doing so for a public purpose and thereby reducing the rent to $1. So all in all, that would result in a net increase of roughly $33,000 on our building rental revenue line. We've also increased ambulance revenues by a very modest $50,000. We are continuing to normalize the increased revenues associated with the fire department performing all of the, what we call the BLS runs, the basic life support runs. So we do expect to probably exceed that by a good amount, but we wanted to stay conservative. And that amount does not account for increased billing rates associated with the newly approved suite of Medicare ambulance billing rates that were approved just after the new year for 2025. So that will generally increase revenue, but we will also reset our private insurance billing rates against those Medicare standard rates established by the government. So that usually sets a reset for us because we factor it on a multiplier. With respect to meals tax, that was bumped by $25,000, up from $475K for fiscal year 25. Collections here have more than rebounded from the pandemic. Our FY24 actuals were just shy of 700,000. Another decrease that we took was for marijuana revenue. Collections have lagged behind projections for actually the past 2 fiscal years. So fiscal year 26, we assumed a revenue and we set that figure to less than the FY24 actuals to account for that trend that we were seeing. And then obviously the other largest driver of our local revenue is state aid. I believe the committee perhaps received earlier this evening an updated long-range financial projection. The change that was made there was to account for the House 1 budget, the governor's budget, which is released after the town's budget. So we had conservatively assumed a 1% growth estimate on local aid in both UGA and Chapter 70. But when you compare the preliminary cherry sheets based on the governor's budget against what had been the long-range plan published in the manager's budget book, you would have found it was net favorable to the town by approximately $550,000. Of note, the per pupil minimum aid, so we are a minimum aid Chapter 70 community, was proposed at $75 per student. Arlington enrolls over 6,000 students per year. So while that may initially appear like bad news because the FY25 Chapter 70 disbursement settled at $104 per student, this may actually be fairly good news because $75 is historically the strongest starting position ever for that per pupil figure. And the governor and lieutenant governor were very proud of that figure. Now, we have no guarantee that as it proceeds through the House and then the Senate, it will increase, but for comparison purposes, fiscal year 25, the year we're in now, the minimum aid per student had been proposed at $30 to start and then found its way to 104. So if you would perceive this as sort of like a new low watermark, this could be potentially beneficial for the town as the budget process, as the state's budget process proceeds. I think that's largely it on the revenue side. Of course, free cash, the town's policy is to use as a budget source 50% of the certified free cash figure for the immediately preceding fiscal year. So that number of $10,298,997 reflects exactly 50% of what we just certified to close fiscal year 24, which if I believe, is actually our historic high water mark for free cash in the town of Arlington. So that's generally a good thing. Get back to Alex.
Great. So quickly, this is just a graphical representation so you can visualize what that chart just showed. You know, the big blue Pac-Man looking figure is property taxes, roughly 171 million, about 75% of our revenue all in. Our next biggest slice of the pie is state aid at just under $30 million, and that does reflect, as Jim stated, the governor's budget proposal. Local receipts are our next biggest section, $10.4 million. Override stabilization fund, free cash, and other funds make up the picture for the year. All right, expenditures. So we'll give an overview here of expenditures. We have a 3.25% growth cap. That's a net figure. And so what this budget does, it holds true to that figure. The municipal departmental appropriations are projected to grow at $1.45 million. Offset and indirect costs are projected to grow at $54,000. Note that that's a less than 3.25% number, which is why our municipal departmental appropriations is less than 3.25. A little bit confusing, but our taxation total, which is sort of a net number, is growing at $1.396 million, which is dead on the 3.25 number as sort of allowed by our override. School department, they're growing at $7.1 million. This is inclusive of a $1.7 million increase over and above their other growth cap figures. For general education, those are 3.5%. For special education, it was 6.5%. And then there was a control that adds 50% of the per pupil cost for each new student. And they just certified their numbers at, I believe it was 115 new students this year. So that's how we account for growth, either up or down in the school budgets fund, was up this year. So altogether, that builds to that 7.37% increase on the school department. Minuteman School is actually coming in with a decrease of $44,000. This is due to a couple of factors, mainly their debt service is going down faster than their expenses are going up. And so neither of those figures saw huge swings, but that is sort of the gist of it here. Non-departmental, so this is a bundled figure of healthcare and pensions. This is going up, as you can see, by a huge sum of 8.8%. We are carrying a 10% increase on our healthcare, our health insurance line. We'll have those figures solidified in sort of early to mid-March. And once we have solid figures on that, we will update the budget accordingly. We've been advised to carry in the 10 to 12% range for a GIC community, which is the largest insurer for, I think it's the largest insurance group in the state, actually. And they have a lot of purchasing power, and this is what we were told that we need to prepare for. Bundled in that, pensions, those are growing at about 5.5%, which is sort of where we would expect it to be. Capital, which is 5% of total revenue, is coming in at $24.2 million. This is kind of a standardized number. Warrant articles at 1.4 million. This is a reduction over last year. There are a few warrant articles that are not carried this year. There were one-timers last year. The 250th, we had some money in there. The Fox Library. And then this year we are also, so included in this number is another $100,000 for private ways. And that's seed money to allow for, we loan essentially that money to residents who then pay it back with interest over the course of 5 years. The Finance Committee's reserve fund is 1% of total revenue. revenue number, which is just under $2.1 million this year. And we're reserving $600,000 as an overlay reserve to allow for abatements and non-collective taxes. So all in, it brings our budget to $225,884,000. And that's a growth of just over $12 million, 5.61% for 26. And back.
All right, and then just like on the revenue side of the equation, this is just a graphical representation via pie chart of the expenditure chart that Alex just reviewed. I think, looking at it from sort of 32,000 feet, if you look at the town's expenditures, combining, the yellow on the bottom with the light blue means we spend about 50% of our money on education between both Minuteman and Arlington Public Schools. The next largest sums there are we spend roughly over a quarter of our money on what I would call fixed operating overhead or fixed assets. So that's your capital, your pensions, and your insurance. So, just sort of like the overhead cost of doing business is a little bit more than a quarter of our money. And then the remaining just shy of a quarter is what is dedicated to providing municipal services, which is that sort of gray block there.
All right, so some highlights from the FY26 budget. As noted, the total expenditure growth is 5.61%. The town being just under 1.4 million of that, the 3.25%. The public APS is 5.4 million with an additional 1.7 growing. So if that 1.7 million is held harmless, there's sort of a blended growth rate of 3.5 plus 6.5 on their general and special education, and then the student enrollment growth factor increase that ties out to 5.6%. And then pensions and insurance, as noted, is growing at 8.8%.
All right. On the town expense increases, you have likely note if you read the message at the introduction to the budget that the majority of new town spending for fiscal year 26 will be dedicated to our new curbside collection and associated contracts that we're projecting to come in at least $750,000 more than we have budgeted for in fiscal year 25. And that is inclusive of where we have already executed a contract for our trash disposal at our site in North Andover. That resulted in per ton disposal costs going up 10%. And we are still working our way through the contracting process for curbside collection. What I can share now is that there was a lot of interest in Arlington's trash contract, so it was fairly competitive. We drew a lot of numbers. We learned that continuing business as normal was simply not going to be affordable for Arlington. And what I meant by that is unlimited yard waste for 40 weeks or 3 seasons was extremely expensive, but even more so was the manual collection of trash and recycling. If we just wanted to have sort of what I would call the gold standard, which is what we have now, and continue to proceed in the future, that would have been, we would have been looking at an increase of multiple millions of dollars. It simply wasn't within reach within the expenditure growth caps that we had agreed to. So that means our only option is to consider an automated disposal system. I know we had somewhat planned for this in advance through the capital plan to provide for the purchase of toters for each household in Arlington. So we do know now that we will have to head in that direction to find a trash contract that we can afford. So there's still, much to be worked out in that respect, but there unfortunately is change coming on that front, and I know that it will be change that is challenging to navigate, but at the same time, we know, in fact, dozens of communities have already, sort of made the change to automation, and they have, though it is not without its hiccups, they have done so, to great success. Really, the driver of the cost is in this market labor, and it's the challenge to actually staff the trucks. But to an automated truck has, sort of side load arms that is staffed by just a driver versus, a rear load manual truck is going to have a driver and two helpers on the back of each truck. So that's why really most waste haulers are moving towards an automated collection system, because it obviously cuts their labor burden by 2/3. But not seen there is the liability and all the workman's comp. So that those folks that work on the back of the trucks, a high percentage of them are being carried on workman's comp because of repetitive motion injuries. You're out in the road all day, heaving and lifting, back injuries. And then of course there's some safety and liability concerns. There are usually a number of individuals on their staffs that, perhaps get struck by vehicles or have other things happen throughout the year. So we saw it as our opportunity to really get ahead of automation, because we know it is essentially going to be the future, as a lot of the smaller waste hauling companies are being swallowed up by Waste Management, Republic Services. There's really only going to be a few large players remaining in a few years, and all of them have committed to going to automation in the future. So it was bound to happen at some point. Sort of one of the next largest investments we are making again in fiscal year 26 is in cybersecurity and some other related costs. They are the largest driver of those costs. We had a request for a security analyst position in the IT department, and given that it would serve the entire network as proposed, we requested that the Arlington Public Schools consider funding 50% of that position, and they agreed, because many of the tools that we would expect that individual to manage, be it CrowdStrike, our new endpoint detection and response platform, or our Barracuda premium email suite of protections, those live on top of the network and protect most all the devices. So it seemed appropriate to have it be a shared cost. So that position was budgeted at just over $84,000. There's also within IT costs associated with, I believe it's maybe an F1 license. There's some lower tier licenses through the Microsoft 365 suite that are no longer going to be offered, and those low cost licenses were ones that we had typically used for people that had needed minimal email usage or functionality. But at the same time, that low level license didn't have the same access to security provisions either. So this will be to bring all town users up to the G3 level, and the cost associated with Microsoft licenses there. It incorporates a cost for what I mentioned before, which is our sort of new premium email protection suite that has a whole host of features that would help prevent against something like the incident that occurred last year. That is a $40,000 increase here. And there's some other software items that I think we'll go through a little bit later in sort of line item format. With respect to the assessors, we did add, so the numbers shown here, just over $52,000 to institute an annual inspection program instead of, and this was sort of requested and is being directed by the Bureau of Local Assessment. Instead of us only conducting property inspections once every 5 years, and we would normally wait for the 4th or 5th year for those cyclical inspections, and we would do, through this committee, a warrant article appropriation through the overlay for, north of $250,000. We're now going to fund that in the operating budget and try to chip away roughly at, 1 to 20% of those inspections annually. Should lead hopefully to more, extremely accurate assessments, but it is also intended to capture any potential new growth sooner, and then it can compound over time. Also in the assessors is, we've been more vigilant about getting income and expense forms from our commercial and industrial landlords. So this would, there's roughly $5,000 increase to assist with to hire consultants to help us evaluate those income and expense reports being submitted by some of our largest property owners to make sure our assessments are as accurate as possible. Those generally are the folks who will be seeking abatements and that carry the largest liability because the assessments may be $86 million. So we saw this as an opportunity to make sure that upfront we should really be scrutinizing the income and expense forms to try to get as accurate an assessment as possible. So we have built that into the budget at the request of the Director of Assessments, but also the Board of Assessors for this year. In the police department, there is a significant increase. You'll see here on the screen, BWC, that stands for body worn cameras. At some point during fiscal year 26, we hope to finally be able to deploy the body worn cameras that we have invested in. With that carries about a $90,000 software as a service subscription necessity for managing all the data associated with the video, accessing them, and I believe helping to, redact for court or public records requests. There's a whole suite associated with providing that service, and roughly $10,000 associated with the newly launched Comfort Dog program. So there are additional expenses associated with having another canine officer with the department and with respect to training, care, and other incidental items. And then some of the general expense increases that we see year over year in both the facilities and public works budgets, as things such as custodial supplies, building supplies, automotive parts, construction materials have generally been increasing, and we haven't had the opportunity in the past few years to necessarily keep up with that. So we try to the extent possible, right size those budgets this year. And we did add what we could to electricity in the facilities budget, knowing that there was a need for a reserve fund transfer request from this committee last year. Tough to predict exactly what the amount of that increase needed is going to be. We haven't seen what our transmission rate increases are going to be, which are largely outside of our control and come through from Eversource. But we are fortunate that in December of 2024 and again in December of 2025, based on the time and our foresight that we bought futures over 2 years ago for our energy usage in the out years. So our supply costs went down in December of 2024 and will go down again, even more significant in 2025 to offset some of that transmission increase. But we also have, removed one building from the facilities department's portfolio. So we had been occupying 23 Maple Street. We have since moved all town operations out of there and rented that out to the Mystic River Watershed Association. That, though it is a house, had a very large energy footprint because it had central systems, and then for the additions and third floor had all electric systems and a lot of window shakers. So we're hoping that our consumption similarly drops there, and we won't be buying all of the heating oil associated with that building either. And to offset some additional utility costs, we are in the process of installing solar panels on the new public works building. Those will be behind the meter, still on a PPA, but our PPA per kilowatt hour rate should be less than half of what we've been paying to Eversource at market rate. So I think those things will all sort of put us in a more favorable position with our utility costs in 26. Actually, we're experiencing some of those savings now in 25. On the personnel side, a few things to highlight. We did talk about the IT security analyst. I sort of jumped ahead on the expense side, but Beyond that, the most notable increase in the Human Resources Department for approximately $12,000 to take the currently 4-day-a-week generalist position and make it a 5-day-a-week position. Obviously, we've been doing a significant amount more of hiring processes in the past few years. That's driven by, frankly, more retirements, but also just a larger number of turnovers. And what we're seeing is we will often have to conduct the same process multiple times to be successful with an applicant. We're experiencing that with the facilities director right now. We're going through our 4th process without having a successful candidate. So there's a lot of work associated with those processes, especially now that we've baked in some sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion principles into those processes, where we have to blind vet everything, and we also now redact anything that could be identifiable to remove any potential implicit bias in the review of those resumes. So we've done some things that require a higher level of effort, but at the same time, our Human Resources Department is managing 2,000 plus health insurance contracts, over 1,000 life insurance contracts. Like, the number of contracts has been going up, but they've also just grown, increasing in their complexity and the requirements for auditing and reconciliation. So we're trying to make sure that we don't necessarily overburden the Human Resources Department. And we were in a position where it was already a 0.8 position, so we didn't have to add an insurance plan. There's no additional overhead associated with it. It was just the cost of the additional day per week. And to be frank, though we didn't know it exactly at the time, we do know now our home rule legislation for civil service has passed, and we have sent in our final letter. So we will now be in charge of the hiring process for identifying and recruiting our police officers. So that is yet another process that's going to require a significant amount of vetting once we get final sign-off to be able to do so. And then in the planning department, though it is not a new position, we have funded through the general fund budget, or proposed to fund, $8,763. And what that does is supplants the offset for the conservation agent and environmental planner, the position held by David Morgan. That is a 1 FTE position that has historically been offset through Conservation Commission fines and fees. We've been noticing a trend, and obviously the Conservation Commission has been alerting us to this over the years, that their expenses are outpacing their revenues. And frankly, this model likely wouldn't be sustainable for a number of years longer. So at the same time, they were requesting an additional position due to what they perceive as increased workload for an additional part-time conservation administrator. Instead of funding yet another perhaps 0.4 or 0.5 FTE, we thought it would be most prudent to first fully fund and protect the 1 FTE position that existed in the budget. That would hold harmless the Conservation Commission's fees and fines account, and they could use the monies being directly being generated by permit activity and enforcement activities to support any additional hours or contract labor that they may require from an additional agent. Beyond that, we did, as you'll see, fund a salary reserve. We do not have current collective bargaining agreements with our public safety unions, so we do make estimates and set aside an amount of money in the salary reserve to be appropriated at some later date by town meeting to, in most instances, retroactively fund cost of living adjustments or other compensation adjustments. And then just want to note and give credit to both information technology and DPW for the second year in a row for working with us to identify budget reductions. At the same time, the departments are making requests for budgetary increases. So we are offloading some software products to the total of just shy of $29,000. Given that the new public works site is largely electrified, we expect our natural gas consumption to go down at that site. We did get some favorable bids for services over at the cemetery, so we did reduce the budget by $30,000. There is perhaps a slight chance that we may have been a bit aggressive in that reduction, because as the new leaf blower ban is about to take hold, I think there is a provision in that contractor that may allow for an escalator for that private contractor, because they expect it to require additional level of effort for them. So that is something we are monitoring. And then another reduction which impacted the offsets that Alex pointed to previously is, obviously we have some grant funded positions that use ARPA dollars. There is, the light at the end of the tunnel is now much closer for those funds. So as one particular position, the community outreach coordinator in DEI, we were notified that that person was going to be vacating their position at some point in time. And as we looked ahead to knowing when it was going to be vacant, there was the likelihood that there wouldn't be much time left when we would be posting that vacancy in fiscal year 26 and beyond, that it would likely be an attractive position that we would fill. So knowing that in advance of the Treasury Department's December 31st deadline for the town to make final obligations for all of its ARPA funds, we made the decision to not carry funds that may not be able to be used for that position and sort of eliminate that uncertainty. And we moved them into another project that was had a bona fide contract and was ready to go and could be uploaded to the portal. And at the same time, the 0.23 FTE psychiatrist, that is a necessary position for the function of the Arlington Youth Counseling Center, but it had only been previously agreed to or mapped out previously in the ARPA framework to be funded through fiscal year 25. So worked with the Arlington Youth Counseling Center to make sure they budgeted that expense in their enterprise for the upcoming fiscal year. Then this is just a tabular format recounting much of what we just discussed, but putting a finer point on a number of the dollar amounts. One thing I didn't know is E911 licenses, that is for so-called enhanced 911. That is a new regulatory framework. That is a statutory provision that we need to comply with. And what that's associated with, at least as I understand it, is we need to go through, now that we have a VoIP phone network, but it is all linked to a central hub, we need to go through and sort of detangle that a bit. So if I were to call 911 from my office, it would say that I'm on the second floor of the annex and not just come like up at 911 like this is, you're calling from the town of Arlington. So we have to sort of reprogram the web of all of our lines to be in compliance with enhanced 911, so that dispatchers are getting increased information from all of the landlines in the town of Arlington. And I think that I largely covered all of the other new requests that were funded on the prior slide. We'll say, and I don't have the figure in front of me, that our master list of all the requests is probably, was for about 1.9 million. So there was probably another 30 or 40 so requests from department heads for things they thought they needed that we were unable to fund this year. And, I will applaud our department heads for taking it well. We knew going into this budget cycle that it was going to be especially tight due to the new trash and recycling contract. So that was messaged loud and clear to department heads in advance that this wasn't likely going to be a year that we had little, if any, flexibility to consider something that was not a contractual obligation or absolutely necessary for delivering like a true and core municipal service. And then, as we do, and again, this is sort of the slides that were used in the presentation to the select board on Monday night. We just want to highlight that this budget, as proposed, does adhere strictly to all of the commitments made to the town of Arlington's voters during the override of November 2023. And I will turn it over to Alex. I think the last slide is the long-range plan, and
Why don't we open it up for questions as to what you covered so far, and then
Okay.
we'll talk about the long-range plan. So
Sure.
do people have questions on the presentation so far? Dean?
I'll go first. I have a few questions, but I'll start with my third, because I think it's the one I care about the most. So I'm looking in your budget and you have this personnel chart, and one of the line items is ARPA/grants. So I'm assuming that's federal money that we still have going into the future.
Mhm.
So my question is, and I'm gonna try to say this in a non-partisan way, right? Trying to understand how much of the federal money is actually ours, right? So like, let me personalize it for a minute. If I was the federal director of the Office of Management and Budget, for the White House, I would advise deleting anything that was appropriated but not spent. I would ship it up to the House in a reconciliation bill and say delete it. That's what I would do, right?
Mhm.
Is it going to impact $1 trillion deficits? No, but it's great theater. People love it. You can take all those appropriate but unexpended bills and whack them. If you remember back in 2020 with CARES Act, they did that. They took like hundreds of billions and got, right? How much of the money is actually ours? Like versus like could someone put through a reconciliation bill and some of that money in the future is gone?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the ARPA money is ours. It lives in our coffers.
Okay.
It's all been legally committed via the Treasury's portal, and we have a bona fide contract, which our federal delegation has been telling us will protect those funds. I think on the town side, what we've been living through the past few days, which is sort of, governing by surprise, is CDBG, because we fund, right, the transportation coordinator position in the COA, we fund our CDBG administrator position, and we offset a good portion of salary for 3 members of our planning department. So sort of that's the one that's been at the top of mind for me, the past 48 hours, because we rely on those funds. We see monthly reimbursements. And I think that's to your point that,
That was my second question.
right, like,
Yep.
the money isn't living in our bank, right? If it was in our bank, it's well protected. If it's a reimbursement basis, we have to assume it is at risk. And then on the school side, though, I'm no expert, and Desi has been sort of issuing guidance in response to it, has been changing announcements largely every half hour about as to where things, if they're frozen or not. On the school side, from my perspective, I think the school lunch program is probably the pot of money that would have the greatest impact. Now, we don't know if that is going to be considered discretionary or not. So I think there's perhaps more questions than answers at this time.
Well, we can find ourselves in kind of especially on the school side, we have a timing as far as I can see. Tell me if I think I'm wrong. Our fiscal year starts July 1, ends June 30, starts July 1. Federal year starts 10/1, it ends 9/30, starts 10/1, right? So we could be thinking like on that school lunch money that it's coming. And forget just freezing money. You could slam through a bill on reconciliation, a really quick tool to get things done, right? And you could cut that out. So we could start the year and it's gone 1 month in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we gotta pivot really fast.
And I agree. I think again, on the school side, it's probably a larger risk because there's more federal money. It's oftentimes passing through to the state with respect to CDBG and what we sort of fund from our operation. Really, the world of exposure there is like $184,000 in staffing costs. But as you know, we then pass through the large portion of our remaining CDBG funds each year, is subrecipient, oftentimes outside the organization.
Yeah.
That's not to say that it wouldn't also have a chilling effect, because many of those programs only exist because of those CDBG funds in this community.
Okay. All right, sorry for being gloomy. You know, if it means anything to you, I was blissfully unaware until Annie dropped it in my lap after the finance committee meeting on Monday. So I've just passed the gloom on to someone else. Now I feel better about
Yeah, and
That's weird.
we'll applaud our federal,
Pass the stress on.
applaud our federal delegation, right? Like it's hard to keep up with how many emails they're sending out to try to keep local officials informed and, oh, a judge made this ruling, here's what it means. Oh, the office of, OMB rescinded their memo of yesterday. Oh, wait, no, there is a post on X that, yes, we took back the memo, but we're still going to do that. And then different folks through MMA or otherwise are clarifying, like, the money will be held up but not rescinded as long as it isn't, perhaps misaligned is the word with certain priorities. So it has been a bit of a moving target. So we've been sort of my, position is like, we need to press pause for a few days before we take any action to try to, like, on our own side, reduce our risk by, like, freezing our own expenditures or telling our subrecipients of any of our grants that they because it's on a reimbursement basis, like, if you incur those costs and then submit requests to us, we lose access to the portal or, the ability to submit reimbursement requests, like, it's ultimately going to impact this third party. So we've been trying to work through a lot of those uncertainties, but again, more questions than answers.
Because even if it's unfrozen now, the future's up is really gonna be probably a likely decrease.
Yeah, FY26 could still be an issue, but, will we have an issue in FY25 with cash flow? The year we're in now.
I didn't even think about that. Okay. Sorry.
Shirley and then John.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Jim, my questions are more pedestrian. With respect to the DPW and the trash collection, what's the outlook on recycling revenues? In other words, people buy, China doesn't buy stuff from us anymore. What's the outlook in actually getting recycling revenue?
Right now, the blended commodity value of a load is going to cover about 50% of the expected fee to process the recycling at a materials recycling facility. So if that's going to be roughly $125 a ton to have our single stream recyclables sorted at a MRF, in Barica or somewhere else, we could expect to probably see in the near term to get a rebate of about $60 per ton. It has been obviously some time since it's been a net positive for that. So that's sort of the outlook we have right now.
So as a sort of follow-up on the DPW, you described the movement towards automation and the arm coming out, picking up, et cetera. How do you envision that working in some of the town streets where the parking is pretty dense?
That was the first question, Charlie, that I asked vendors. And, their response is typically, you're no worse than Medford, Brookline, Newton, or, and they name any number of cities where they have implemented this previously. So, I worried about that. I worry about snow removal. I worry about some of our narrow dead end streets. But so you're going to have to back down, do one side, like come out, find some other area to do some weird point turn, and come back in and, go down the other way. Like, how is that any more efficient? But, that is a risk they're sort of willing to accept. I was concerned about how hilly our streets are, and are our containers always going to be on level enough ground? And, the vendors are like, you're part of it. If you take a step back and look at the USGS maps, you're just on the backside of the hills that are in Belmont, and we have no problem doing it over there. So we receive all the assurances that they can manage this.
Is that what Belmont says though?
They have not expressed any issues. So,
So as a
Yeah.
follow-up, with respect to DPW, can you tell us what the status of the DPW building project is?
so we are nearing completion, and what I will say that the chair and I did discuss briefly, try to liaise between the project team and the permanent town building committee. They are requesting an audience with this committee sometime in the month of February. It does look like we're gonna need a little bit of additional funding to close out this project. I will say, and I have to confirm this, there's the possibility that we may, when we request an audience with this committee, may need to do so in executive session because of a recent claim filed by the contractor. But at the same time, we are pursuing a related negotiation with the industrial parties. We found some pretty significant things underground during the course of the project that were not known to any parties, and that at the town's cost, we had to remediate. Think like tanks of chromium at significant amounts of money. Though they did have a release from the prior settlement, you know, I've retained an environmental counsel to help guide us through potentially getting some level of reimbursement for some of those expenses we've incurred during the project. But if successful, and I think we will be successful on that front to some extent, the timing of those funds and the fact that they would have to go back to the general fund couldn't be used to offset the expenses we've already incurred in the project. So we have a few different moving parts there, but all that to say, I do hope that, you know, perhaps in a couple weeks, when a few things come more into focus, that we can invite, you know, the people who know the nitty-gritty about that project to come and present to this committee and seek a little bit of additional funding to hopefully successfully close the project out sometime soon.
My recollection is that, when we did the field a decade or more ago, we actually owed the industrial parties money, but we didn't pay them. Is that correct?
That I don't know. What I've had explained to me is there was sort of a cap on, you know, the amount of money that they were gonna be liable for, and that cap had been reached. That's what I had explained to me, but I'm not sure
You might,
if there was money that we
check with John Marr.
we have, and I've looped John into those conversations, but it hadn't come up previously. That perhaps there was monies we had owed and didn't pay.
So, moving on to the ARPA positions, I'm a little bit confused by your presentation. I thought the ARPA positions were gonna go away when the ARPA money went away. But it looks as if they're migrating into enterprise funds. Is that correct? And if that's the case, are we still, aren't the citizens still paying for those positions?
The only position would be the psychiatrist in AYCC, and it's my understanding, and I didn't approve that position initially, is that there was already psychiatrist funding in the AYCC budget. So I think during the ARPA period, it was basically being used to the extent possible, hold harmless the enterprise. But it was something that had previously lived there and was required previously to provide oversight of the clinicians.
Because the town is the guarantor of last resort for these enterprise funds, right?
Right.
So, and unless they have additional revenues to come in and pay for that position, it's ultimately gonna come out of the town's treasury.
That's correct.
So is this position being paid by extra revenues, or is it ultimately being guaranteed by the town?
Sure. Do you know how the enterprise was handling it this year?
Yeah, it's, it should generate significant enough revenues to cover the position, is what, Colleen said to us. So, she's confident that the enterprise can support the position and it won't lead to like eating into retained earnings or anything like that.
So one ARPA position is actually going away, and the other one is
Right.
being funded by extra revenues.
It's a part-time position at AMPC,
Yeah.
right? And the, the position, the community outreach coordinator is going off the books. And it's also important to note that the ARPA funding is not fully gone, it doesn't need to be fully gone until December 31st of 2026. So we have another year and a half of sort of our spending runway. And there are still a couple of, there's like 1.3 ARPA positions that remain on the books for now. And then it's anticipated that when the funding goes away, that those positions will not be continued.
Thank you.
John and Annie?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Jim, and thank you, Alex, for a very detailed presentation. My question relates to the $7.1 million increase to the school budget, including the budget. That's on top of a $7 million increase last year and a $5 million increase for the prior 3 years before that. So that's a total of a $29 million increase, bringing the school budget from $74 million up to $103 million. My question is, has anyone vetted, what that $7 million is gonna go towards and what the taxpayers are gonna get in return for that $7 million? I've asked this question kind of annually, and usually I get the answer of formulas and prior commitments and everything, but I think it's a big enough number where there should be a very significant return for that $7 million. I know last year's $7 million increase, we received the budget on a Saturday morning, then we reviewed it and voted on it that Monday. So we certainly didn't get a lot of detail for the $7 million increase last year.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what are the taxpayers gonna get for that $7 million this year?
Thanks, John. I appreciate the question.
Yeah.
And so that you're aware, we just set the bottom line figure for the school department. Their budget is still being prepared and then gets vetted by the school committee. So we generally wouldn't see it until the same time you would see it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a question I would be able to answer today.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I guess why is it such a large number? So why isn't that $3.5 million?
Yeah, so I would say, this is what, was presented to the voters in terms of how to fund the school department. And frankly, once those commitments are made, we say, this is how their budget is going to increase. I wouldn't take it upon myself to unilaterally not deliver on the commitments that were made to the voters to fund Arlington Public Schools at a level. So yeah, to your point, the long range financial plan is based on formulas, and the override amount and the commitments associated with that override are based on the formulas there. So there really isn't much sort of haggling as we go through and set that top level number. It's okay, here's what it was last year, here's what gen ed, special ed have been agreed to increase. Here's what the voters said could be added to, the budget fiscal year 26. So we do that, and we just make the calculations, set their bottom line number, and then, from there, it's turned over to the superintendent, school committee.
Yeah, I just want to point out one thing. The override was a general override. It was just general budget, schools and town expenses. There was no commitments on the ballot. I know that the town selectman did mention a commitment, but the voters did not approve any allocations to the school, especially 2 years out. I just think for that amount of money, you can't, I would hope that people are saying, what do we get for that $7 million? The answer should not just be because that's what the Excel spreadsheet says.
Mhm.
But anyway, thank you very much for the response.
Annie?
So I have a couple of questions. Some of them are about pensions. I don't know if you want to wait for long range planning before we talk about pensions, but then we'll see about how our pensions operate. So when we are setting aside money for the pensions in the 5-year plan, that is to pay for fully funding our pensions, correct?
Mhm.
And that is to fully fund based on our current actuarial status, and our actuarial status is calculated every 2 or 3 years. Annually, and that it looks at both our current employees, our retirees, And we have both the potential addition of new positions or the filling of consistent positions with younger people. And we have retirees who roll off of our pension system. I assume families get some extension of the pension after someone deceased.
There's 3 different options that pensioners can select when they're retiring, and they do various different things. One of them is to pass it on to a named beneficiary. So yes, potentially.
Right, so do we have some way of calculating the effect of maintaining a position or adding a position on our future obligation compared to retirees who roll off, families who cease to get whatever the extension was, et cetera, et cetera? Do we know that we're kind of balanced?
To be honest, that's actually something we were talking about earlier today to try to frankly hone in on what that figure is. And I think we have some more work to do that. But at the same time too, as headcount increases, obviously to a much lesser extent on the town's budget, but haven't seen what the potential headcount increase may be for Arlington Public Schools this year, is understanding what that impact may have on our OPEB liability as well, introducing additional folks into the system. So that's something we have talked about needing to work on a little bit more. So that's something that we may want to discuss perhaps more in depth at a future date.
Okay, so, but our OPEB liability is not in law.
It is
Correct.
not, but
Do we anticipate it becoming in law?
nothing to anticipate there. So really what it's doing now is essentially potentially harming our credit rating because it is looked at with, as a significant liability for the community.
But it's looked at within the context of all the municipalities in America, correct? Or just the ones in Massachusetts?
There is a framework that applies to Massachusetts and it compares us to our peers. And at present, we have a relatively higher liability than some. So that's sort of the more micro analysis a rating agency.
Do we have a higher liability in the sense that our peers are funding their OPEB liability faster, or they have a lower?
We don't know specifically, other than we're not comparing favorably. So we don't know if it's the total amount or the funding rate.
I think in the future it's gonna be important to know what that liability is. So I have another question then. Simply because it was asked in the context of my budget reviews. If we don't backfill a position, okay, and presumably that a position that already exists, that position is providing services. When we look at our obligations under our commitments, under the override, do we feel like we committed to provide a continuing level of service under our override terms? You understand? We always talk about how we're not gonna raise taxes. Okay, but the statement that you posed here had contained an idea that I don't know as we've actually said, which is that we're also not gonna cut services and continue to provide the services people expect to get. So reducing services before we take another vote would be similar to increasing taxes before we take another vote, or otherwise. Yes? I mean, I think
Want
that's
to
the
review
case.
exactly.
Would be on your slide about the override commitments.
While maintaining quality
While
municipal
maintaining
services.
quality municipal services, yes. So when we are looking at vacant positions and talking to department heads about backfill, we need to keep the continuing provision of quality services in mind, yes?
I agree.
So, yeah.
Yep.
Chuck, then Rebecca, and then Ellen.
She said me.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
she said, no, that's what I said. So Jim, I know you don't have a formal policy in hiring, at least that's what I understand, but do you have a perspective you can share or guidance you give your department heads on whether there's a hiring freeze, or whether it's only mission critical, or there's particularly, I think, like, Andy, dealing with vacancies. You know, like we see vacancies in the budgets and it's like, I don't know how, and some have been there for years, and it's like, why are they there?
Mhm. So at present, we do not have any sort of hiring freeze instituted. There may be, is probably one position I can think of that we're not actively trying to fill. But beyond that, at present, there is no hiring freeze in effect. What I would say is, as you know, shortly after I got this job in 2023, and knowing, and that was sort of, you know, late summer, and knowing there was an override vote in November of 2023, as soon as I had that job, I said, well, you know, press pause. And, you know, through our Munis system, any requisition generates a personnel action form so that you can post a position. So I would have the final say there to say like, let's hold off, you know, let's hold off. Like, instead of filling positions that in the event of an unsuccessful override vote would then need to be, you know, laid off in advance of those votes, I made the decision to press pause unless something was, you know, the word I use, and you wouldn't find it in any municipal dictionary, was mission critical, right? Like, okay, you know, that we, you know, we can't go without it. We can not have a treasurer. We've got, you know, we must have a treasurer. Let's move ahead and fill that position immediately. So, you know, nothing exists right now, but I can see perhaps a similar practice occurring in advance of a future override vote to sort of potentially help stabilize the organization or prevent from, you know, to how far that pendulum might have to swing should there be an unsuccessful vote in terms of how many people, if they were recently hired, then have to be off-boarded.
So just to follow, so the perspective we should take then, as we're going through these budgets, is that if we see a new position, we should ask ourselves, is that mission critical?
Well, you've already said what the new positions are.
Yeah.
Everything, there are very few new positions.
But there are some, and what about vacancies that exist that we were just talking last meeting, a lot of vacancies that didn't seem mission critical? Should we challenge that, or?
I mean, certainly anything is up for challenge, but I'm only aware of there being one vacancy that we're not actively trying to fill. So any other longstanding vacancies are just presenting a challenge to fill, if you will.
Okay. I have one other question, different. The assessor's automated data collection, I think that's a good idea. Do you know how much money that's gonna save? You said you're gonna get better insight into the assessments, and you're gonna bring that dollars in earlier.
I wouldn't look at it as saving money. What we would hope is that perhaps it could generate more revenue.
Okay, yeah.
But, you know, I imagine if we were to look at it from savings, if we're spending.
Or revenue.
Yeah, but even from savings though, if you think about it, like, we're spending $50,000 now for inspections, we're gonna get more inspections for that $50,000 than if we had to conduct all those inspections 5 years from now, because every one of those costs, as we bid them out, goes up every few years. So I
That's
think
great.
you're right that there's savings there too, but I think we thought about more with regard to revenue and
Oh,
having
revenue's
accurate
better,
assessments.
yeah, how
Right.
much revenue?
I wish I could project how much new growth we may capture sooner, but I fear I can't until
Yeah,
perhaps we get our first year under our belt.
yeah, sure. All right,
Can I make
great, thank you.
Can I make a point about the assessing program also? We're also adding consulting money for the income and expense review. And this is to look at our sort of our commercial landlords in town. And the way that they are assessed is on income and expense reports. And what this will help us do is, it feels sort of like short money that we can get expert eyes in reviewing those and ensure that we are assessing those as highly as we possibly can.
So what do you think the net gain there is gonna be?
This year, so we instituted penalties for people who do not return those. We generated an excess of about $37,000 or $38,000, I think. So I'm not entirely sure, but this will help us to sort of put the pressure on our commercial landlords to turn those in, because some people are willing to just pay the fine. And it's okay, pay the fine and we'll take the money, but, when we do get, these reports, this will allow us to make sure that we're assessing them, sort of as highly as possible, at the highest levels.
Excellent. But it's a net gain though.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, all right, good.
But
Good.
what I would just add, and I may have mentioned this before, especially with our larger, sort of what we call commercial properties, think like a Arlington 360 or your Brigham Square, like, you know, there are massive housing complexes that are assessed at, you know, $90 million or $50 million. If we're not incredibly accurate on that assessment, the abatement application that we have to carry a liability for is on the order of magnitude of six figures, right? In terms of like the tax revenue that we could be on the hook for if we're not accurate. And those are the types of properties that are the ones that will, right? It is good business for them to pursue abatements and take the town to the appellate tax board each year because there's so much money on the line.
So the consultant reduces the risk then too, right?
Yes, but that's what I viewed as probably
The
the biggest benefit because, you know, as we tabulate the liability for all those properties, they file for abatements or pursue the ATB, like that could be a big hit to our overlay.
Great, thank you.
Rebecca. Pass, thank you. Alan.
Chris, I have
Alan, and then
Okay, thank you. Two short comments and a short question. So, first, I just wanted to comment on John and Yanni's a little bit about commitments and school growth and things like that. There's an override coming up, and that'd be a really good time to talk about that and get the commitments in writing or whatever and understand what they're. And then another question of Yanni's. I know in business, we talk about fully burdened labor costs and in a lean startup of like 10-15% of salaries and a fatter company. If we could have just a general simple number, if we're hiring somebody for $85,000, what's the total cost of that? I think that would be useful for us. And then the simple question, the pensions / insurance growth was 8.8%, which is pretty high. And I was wondering, are they both growing 8.8 or is, you know, what's growing fast and what are the trends?
Insurance is at about 10%, projected at 10%. Pensions was less than 6%.
Okay.
So that blended rate is where we end up in the.
Okay, so you think the 10% is that the future? Is it gonna go higher? What are you thinking?
This is back-to-back years of between 8 and 10%, I think.
Yeah. And for a while,
Like
we're in a
it
sweet
must
spot.
plateau. But, and, you know, I, again, don't know the ins and outs of this, but what I've been hearing, you know, from different insurers and such is that it's in fact, like, one of the main drivers now is a GLP-1 drug and how they're expensive and taking off, but they're, you know, are being blamed for a lot of the increased insurance costs. Whether or not that's valid, I don't know.
I feel like the GIC honeymoon is over. Okay, thank you.
so Jennifer, then Daryl, Sherilyn, and Mike.
A couple of unrelated questions. One is the police contract. Do we have any insight about and what happens with the next contract? You know, since the contracts were, you know, in negotiation, are we starting the negotiations for the next contract yet, or do we just wait until?
So, yeah, the police contract, so we have two police unions here. We have our ranking officers and our patrol officers. And so, we'll start with patrol. They have just come out of contract, so they expired at the end of 2024. Right, so, they're about 6 months out of contract right now. We're, sort of paused with them because with our ranking officers, we still do not have a settled contract for the 22 to 24 period. We're currently in arbitration at the JLMC, and so that process is playing out right now. When that ultimately does become finalized, then I would anticipate getting back to the table with, if not the patrol union, with both of them.
Right, yeah, I knew all that, but I was just wondering if we had any like guesstimates of timing or we
It's
just can't make
really
that.
slow working through the JLMC or at the sort of whims of scheduling nightmares. I would hope that sometime this spring or summer that we'll be able to get the ranking officers finalized. Maybe it'll happen sooner, I don't know.
It seems like a perpetual question. last year, there was a discussion of $2 million of ARPA money to evaluate adding climate control to schools. Did we make any decision about that or what, or
To add climate
like
control of the
air
schools.
conditioning? Yeah,
So ultimately, there was no project that was put out to bid by the December 31st timeline that could have funds obligated to it, so
did we
It
have an
is-
assessment for assessment
at the Thompson School
or
itself and
Okay.
some design plans at a few other school buildings, and the construction that was funded was for a series of rooftop unit replacements due to some failures at two different school buildings.
Okay. And then the third question is about the long range plan, but it sort of relates to the discussion we're having here. What jumps out at me, I think a lot of people about the long range plan, is this huge free cash amount. And I assume, I know that is partly iterative because it's half of what the previous year and going up each year. I also assume it has to do with unfunded positions that are funded but not taken. Is that the major driver of that, or is there something else?
The major driver is probably collections in excess of
Oh, okay.
estimates.
Oh, good.
And then the next largest driver would be turnbacks. But of those turnbacks, right, in recent years, it's been, like the reserve fund is nearly 2 million and we only spend, 400,000, right, like the remainder of the finance committee's reserve fund gets turned back.
Mhm.
So that's usually like the number one driver of turnbacks. And then, because it's frankly, the next largest budget is the insurance budget. So of course, that is tied to positions, but really you get into the nitty gritty of people, like you're figuring out, like, are they gonna be on an individual plan? Are
Right.
they gonna be on a family plan? And that's 10 grand versus 30 grand.
Sure. So some
Or
of those
they-
numbers were being conservative that were.
Yeah, and, or are they not gonna take insurance at all?
Sure.
But we carried a certain number of family plans and, hey, we didn't meet that metric, so I think the insurance budget is usually the next largest generator of turnbacks, and then it gets down to the departmental level.
So I was just sort of briefly glancing at the last 10 years of free cash numbers.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you know as well, but a whole bunch of years at 11 million, but 10 years ago, it was 7 million, which represented about 5% of our budget. Now we're up to about 9% of our budget.
Mhm.
Would there ever be thoughts of sort of dipping in at a higher percentage for 1 year, especially if maybe we want to extend, an override timeline? I mean, I know that's not a decision you guys make, it's a political decision, but.
Yep.
But is there has there any discussion about that?
But not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Sort of one of the fundamental principles of the long range financial projection. I think what you're alluding to, one potential amendment to the assumptions that we had talked about maybe bringing for the long range planning committee to consider, is every year beyond the first year where you're taking 50%, the revenue assumption is at the half of the 10-year trailing average of free cash.
Hmm.
But as you alluded to, our profile has changed. If you were to only look 5 years back, might it be a more realistic revenue projection in those out years? And that, frankly, we take some of those red numbers.
Right. So that
Drop
we
them
wouldn't
a
be taking more money, it would just be sort of making this
It's a change in
less
assumption in the model.
conservative, right? Yeah, Daryl.
Yeah, so many, many years ago, my first job, one of my first assignments with the city of Boston, Reagan had just gotten elected and everybody was terrified of all the things that he was gonna do, which now when you look back on it, in the context of what's going on now, actually seems pretty quaint.
Yeah.
But one of my first assignments was to identify Boston's Boston's federally funded programs and grants and things like that. So that if and when the Fed did cut things, we at least had the information that we could go to our delegation of the lobbying. Are you confident, and this is sort of asking
you and them sort of as a proxy of the school department too, are you confident that we have a handle on what our potential exposures are? I know you can't anticipate what they will do.
Yeah.
But in terms of you mentioned CDBG earlier. And, there's some funding indirectly through DESI. But are you and the school department confident that you clear picture on what our potential exposures are?
Yeah, so what we had the comptroller generate, so we obviously track every source of revenue we get, and they are categorized, right? There's federal, and then there is federal pass through state. So we've run reports to show, what have those sources been over the past 5 years, so we can see everything that we've had, a little bit more challenging to project moving forward. I think that, there are certain federal funds that have, especially on the education side, that have been already, so that I don't think are gonna be at risk, because the administration has already said, like, these types of grants, loans, Title I, these things will be held harmless. I think we have some degree of confidence there. Me personally, I think we rely on a lot of, I was grateful that we've been successful, because it was something that I really wanted to do, and start pushing for federal earmarks or congressionally directed spending. We've received 2 $1 million awards over the past 2 years to do some great work with stormwater, or to connect the Mystic to Minuteman. Those funds do not live in the town's coffers yet, and we have begun planning efforts, and those are the types of things that, and this, before yesterday's memo, were the things we were meeting with Whip Clark's office and Senator Markey's office about, because those monies are not yet under contract. And if they still live in those federal coffers, I think there is some, what we were counting on is like sort of one, big one-time grant monies that, I hate to be a pessimist, that I think are very much so, just by the virtue of going to Massachusetts, potentially a risk.
I think right now, in that context, being a pessimist is actually pretty prudent.
Right.
Thanks, Jim.
Carolyn,
Traditionally, health insurance has sort of gone in 3-year cycles where it goes up, and then it comes down, it goes up. Are you saying that for 5 years, it's been consistently increasing by 8 to 12%?
For the past 2 years.
Past 2.
And those are the 2 budgets I was involved in producing, that's why I know those figures.
Right.
But I'm only aware of, I think the past 2 years have been, well, you're like, maybe we're at the peak now.
Maybe.
Hopefully.
Right. Okay, all right.
Michael,
We have a canine officer, Roger, for $10,000. He doesn't, it's not a big hit on a salary.
He is not collecting a salary. I will say, the dog itself, we were fortunate, and I believe Mr. Foskett may have been instrumental in helping us secure a grant to help actually purchase the canine and help with some of the training. So it is a more expensive program than perhaps the $10,000 indicates, but fortunately there were some outside sources of funds that assisted.
I think it's a good choice. Tell me briefly about one meeting, the agenda and minutes platform. Is that something that's going to be benefit inside town hall, or to boards, committees, commissions that are responsible for returning their agendas and minutes?
Can you say that one more time?
Is the new platform for agendas and minutes, which we have here as one meeting?
Yep.
Is that something that is most a benefit that will inure mostly to the town clerk, or is that something that's going to help the numerous volunteers in town who submit agendas and minutes for posting?
It is my sincere hope that it helps everyone in town staff, the boards, committees, and commissions, but then our residents who are looking for that information. But one of my hard lines on finding this product was, this is Arlington specific, I had to find a product unlike Novus that would allow unlimited boards, committees, and commissions to use it, because I told the vendor, we basically have unlimited board. Right, because right now Novus is only supporting, you know, a handful of boards, committees, and commissions. This will allow us to train as many people as want to use it, to have access to it. And we are going to migrate every document we have, every existing minute and agenda. And I will tell you, this is a bear of a task behind the scenes to find people to rename files going back years, but they won't live in individual file folders on a committee page by year. We're gonna put them all in one repository, and there will be a search function. Hopefully the search function works remarkably well, but we're trying to move everything into one place and expand use of this platform to other boards, committees, and commissions, so they can have interactive digital agendas, and you can have hyperlinked agenda items and upload your supporting materials like you'd see for a school committee meeting or a select board meeting. So we're sort of designing those. The hardest part of this change is going to be, we have to have template agendas and minutes. As we've sampled an agenda or minute from every board, committee, or commission in Arlington, believe it or not, every single one of them is different. I want italic, I want centered, I want left justified, I want underline, I want bold, like, we're all gonna have to live
Right. How's
With-
it feel to warrant?
we're gonna have to live with a template, because we also have to, there is, you know, the Department of Justice gave a new ruling for the, what is it, WCAG guidelines, like there are digital accessibility guidelines that are no longer gonna be guidelines, they're going to be law. So we are gonna have to work towards investing in resources to make our digital materials accessible, because frankly, that is the environment in which most people get their information from the town. So we're gonna have to build those templates to ensure they are as accessible as possible and can feed into machine readers and other things. So that will be, though it sounds like there's a lot of good, I think that will be what becomes the challenge for that change with many boards, committees, and commissions who have their own Word document template and just wanna, you know, populate it and stick with it. That won't be feasible forward.
I think it'd be a great help in getting those in and getting them made available to the public. There are huge variations in how successful, let's just say, how successful some committees are in getting their agendas and minutes posted back on the
We audit them annually and we send notices, and there's always a handful of committees like, please, you're behind, and, you know, not always received well.
What's the end user, property owner experience going to be, the change in the property owner experience of the new trash pickup contract?
I would say the end user experience that I do not look forward to rolling out is now, you're gonna get a trash cart and a recycling cart, sizes to be determined. That is what your trash and recycling have to fit in. Arlington is a community that loves to put all their recycling in some sort of bin or container, and then a box of boxes. Drive the roots, a box of boxes is a very, very common occurrence in Arlington. The machine arm can't grab a cardboard box of boxes, so folks are now gonna be required to break down, cut up, fold cardboard, and put it into the recycling bin. That is going to be, I think, the change that I'm going to get a lot of angry phone calls about. I know it can be done. I don't live in Arlington, neither does Alex. We both lived in multiple containerized communities for years we're both like, wait, that's a thing? Like, you don't have to put your recycling in a bin? But that will be a change, right? Like, you know, I joked that, you know, we're gonna have to let Mount Auburn know and a few others that they're gonna get a lot more hand slice injuries from utility knives for, you know, from folks, you know, having to cut up their boxes each week, perhaps sometimes in the dark. And then, you know, the other change that will be felt is the gold standard of yard waste collection, right? Like, we are a 3-season community, 40 weeks, every single week, unlimited. That is a benefit enjoyed by probably only 2 or 3 other municipalities in the entire Commonwealth. Yard waste costs, upwards of over $30,000 a week. In order to hold harmless trash and recycling curbside as core municipal services, we sort of have to balance our solid waste budget on yard waste. So I can see, and we will be strategic in doing so, reducing that number of weeks so that perhaps in the middle of the summer, when perhaps you're just generating grass clippings and you may not have a significant amount accumulated, maybe it then goes every other week or every third week. Like we won't be able to buy as many weeks as we bought previously, but we're gonna try to roll them out in a manner that will have the least amount of perceived impact, and then try to design some sort of safety valve or relief valve for people. Like, hey, I've got a roll-off container here. If you're really in a pinch this week and it's not one of our weeks, it's on you, but you can drive to X location and there'll be an open top roll-off or events for that type of things to try to make sure that our residents don't feel as much impact, that we're able to come in within our existing budget. So,
Last one
thank
from
you for
me.
that question.
Thank you, appreciate that. Last question for me is, do you have a number, sort of, I take this up on, sort of Dean's theme of what keeps you up at night. Is there a number out there for an estimate, to whatever degree of accuracy, for deferred maintenance on all town buildings?
I don't have anything legitimate that I could say to you this evening in terms of that's been studied or vetted by professionals. We need probably a more up-to-date building needs assessment for that.
I thought we had one.
Nothing from recent years.
I have a question about toters. So those residents who have already purchased a very large one, if the town goes with a middle size, who's going to enforce not picking up the larger toters?
So the only toters that are gonna be the ones that get collected are the ones that are gonna be provided by the town. So individuals that have purchased toters we will provide means to take those back and dispose of them if you wish, or they could serve as overflow buckets at someone's house. Someone could turn them into yard waste, but the only ones the truck will be collecting are toters that are issued by the town of Arlington.
So they'll bypass a non-town issued toter.
Correct. Our rate will be based on picking up one of each toter at each household. And if a household wanted an additional toter, it could be made available, though this is far past anything we've agreed to or calculated. We've seen other communities, right? Like if you wanted to have a second trash toter, for example, you might pay maybe $100 a year, or $125 a year to have that available to your household. Or what we've seen happen in other communities, because folks already have toters, if they had surge trash in 1 week, right? Like you just keep it in the other extra toter that you already had, and then save it to put out if you were a little lighter the next week into that toter.
You warn Charlotte, she's gonna get a lot of toters.
Yeah. Annie, and then Jordan, and then Topher, and then we'll talk about the long range.
So two things, I wanna go back to the federal grants for just 1 second. You talked a lot about spending in the current fiscal year, but you're really not concerned that in 2026, they won't just cut all of these programs?
I have concern based largely on the uncertainty, but if we read at face value that if funds associated with X, Y, and Z are only those that are going to be deemed not fundable, as we looked at those criteria that were listed against what our uses have been for CDBG funds or some of our other recurring funds, we didn't identify anything that screamed like, oh, that would be a problematic use of those funds, and we could expect that to be at risk in the future.
Okay, I think we have to worry about the possibility that all of our regular funding, that we just assume like.
Yeah.
Education funding and CDBG are just gonna go away.
Yeah.
I think we need to confuse the plan for that,
Yeah, so.
in conjunction with the schools.
So with respect to CDBG, I looked at just like the town operational portion of that, and it's like, though we make a lot of capital improvements and capital projects each year that we would, have to forgo, but like the operational impact of that is on the order of magnitude of, upwards of at least $200,000. So it is, it's something that I've looked at trying to quantify and calculate, because we're not all of a sudden gonna not provide senior transportation through the COA or, do those volunteer efforts. So I think that, I don't wanna be too alarmist yet, just because there's so much uncertainty, but, those are the only funds that I have really scrutinized. I agree that we need to look at some of those education funds as well. I don't have the comfort of the level of expertise with, we look at that comes in, there's like 30 lines of them and they're different accounts, and I'm not exactly sure how the school department is using some of those funds to know if they might pose an immediate risk.
Yeah, I mean, school lunch, special education.
School lunches is millions of dollars.
Yes.
Do you have anything else?
I have two more questions. Something we keep talking about here that I keep forgetting to ask you about, because it's mine and Rebecca's budget to talk about, is whether or not the consolidation transportation really ought to be an enterprise fund. And what process do we need to go through to change that?
We talked about something similar this year, as there do seem to be some challenges with running it as an enterprise, and
Yeah.
also talk about, looking ahead to a future override, would there be an opportunity to increase the general fund subsidy, or just sort of fold in senior transportation as one of the commitments in the future, especially as we just got a grant, and we did already get the money for it, to purchase, a third all-electric van to serve with the rides to Eats and Market Basket. Senior transportation is a critical component, so we did identify that as a risk. We also know that it's further fragile by that enterprise relies upon a CDBG allotment annually, so it complicates it further. I think it warrants further discussion, and so again, I wasn't involved at that time. I do believe we committed during a prior override, is it $50,000, essentially like a general fund subsidy to go to that enterprise, but I think over time, if the desire is to provide essentially free rides and not have it be free for service, then the model could be sort of a house of cards, because it's just relying on a bunch of grant sources or outside sources that the minute one doesn't come through, you're out of balance.
So is there something I can do to help you with this process over the next year? Because otherwise people are gonna bug me about it again.
Well, you can have a conversation offline.
Okay.
Whatever the other question.
My only other question is, you've talked about recycling, you've talked about yard waste, what about composting?
That we did put as part of our proposal to offer that service to our residents. If the municipality were to pay for and provide it, it would have been north of $1 million. So it wasn't necessarily cost effective. It's not yet a service being provided by the major haulers. It's still only being provided by the same 2 or 3 folks that are out there. We even spoke to a few to try to come up with this sort of hybrid option where, they could, this is Arlington, like get a split truck, you can collect yard waste on one side, food scraps on another, take them to these joint composting facilities, but we weren't able to arrive at a position where doing curbside food scrap collection was going to be a viable option without sacrificing one of the other three services that we were accustomed to.
Jordan and then.
Yeah, my question's more just general about sources of revenue. And Jim, you mentioned that you were talking with our elected delegation, maybe get more earmarks, pursue some of those fundings. I'm just curious if there were any other sources of revenue that you're either pursuing right now or you think the town should pursue. And I know that the governor refiled the Municipal Modernization Act 2.0. Hopefully that goes through within this legislative session, but curious what your thoughts are, if there's anything you're pursuing.
Nothing jumps out, Jordan. Good point about the Municipal Empowerment Act. I think there are some increases to local options there that would benefit Arlington with respect to both meals and lodging tax increases. One thing we are looking at is with respect to analyzing our marijuana revenue. We're not sure we're collecting exactly what we expected to be collecting from our dispensaries. So that's something we're going to be taking a closer look at in the months to come to sort of audit that and make sure that our collection, that we're being paid essentially that we should be, what we should be getting paid, because we know that the window for that revenue is now, because the changes to the regulations governing marijuana, like the local marijuana excise, have it such that in our next round of host community agreements, you can no longer have a flat, give us 2%, we're 3%. So knowing that doesn't exist in the future, it is making us scrutinize and look back to, hey, when this program started, have we been collecting what we should? So that's just one that was on top of mind. The other, not a new revenue source, but I mentioned our ambulance revenues. With respect to the rates we charge, we need to right-size those. Something that I am contemplating, having learned, we've been writing off losses with respect to our ambulance runs. I am looking towards, and maybe put before the select board a policy decision to send to collections unpaid ambulance bills. Likely not for Arlington residents, but for any residents who reside outside of Arlington who made use of our EMS services and then sort of scoff laws and didn't pay the bills. So we are looking, sort of trying to turn over some of the rocks that already exist and make sure that we are getting that, which we.
No, thank you for the answer. And, I hope with new leadership at the CCC, some of the stuff around marijuana can finally, for a lack of a better term, make sense.
It's a good way to put it.
Topher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a lot of my questions got answered already because other people asked them, but first, I agree with Annie about the contingency for like just losing all federal money. The body cams, I may have missed this, but is the negotiation on that's separate from the compensation contracts, or is it rolled into that?
It is part of it.
So it's not going to get settled until you do a 24 to 26 or 20, I guess, the next 3-year contract with like patrol officers.
It would be it is hinging upon the ranking officer's contract.
Okay, so it's
from the 2022.
okay, so it's
cycle.
that one. So okay, so you're hoping right at the spring.
Already addressed in the officer's contract.
Oh, okay, good. And then just on the comfort dog thing, is there another officer that gets hired with the dog, or is that just an existing officer gets additional training?
Existing officer receives additional training in a slightly different vehicle. It requires modifications.
And is the 10K like an ongoing expense?
Yes, for training, care.
Maintenance.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
And that, just to expound on that, the officer that received it is the school resource officer. So that the dog finds itself in the school buildings.
Right, yeah.
Daily.
I saw the question.
So let's talk about the long range planning. I know you've touched upon some aspects of it, but why don't you run us through it?
All right, so, and I know that it's probably too small to see from where most of you are sitting, but, the long range plan up in front of us is the most up-to-date version that we have. Project out the next 5 years. It is just sort of as is custom of this plan, it is the most accurate in the next year, and then in each year out, the further away you get from present day, the, I guess, less accurate it becomes, just because it's harder to predict further out for the future. So, we start in the revenue section for FY 26, which is the sort of the second column at the top. You'll see that these figures are familiar because we just went over them. Our total revenues total out at 230,847,000. The next section, as we work our way down, is our school sections. It has our new additional growth of $1.7 million. The general education and special education budget, and then the next is the growth factor, which is driven by our new enrollment, which is an additional $1.07 million, bringing the total school budget to the $103 million figure we talked about earlier. Next down is Minuteman. We have our normal operating capital, and then their exempt capital figure. Those total out to the net reduction of about $45,000, I think, this year. And we have our personnel, town personnel, and our town expenditure lines, followed by our town offsets, which net out to the total of $44,353,000, excuse me. Working our way down, we have our capital budget, and there's a weird number in my version of the plan, I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing there. But below that, we have our exempt debt service, our non-exempt debt service, our cash. And these are driven sort of by the recommendation of the capital committee. And then our offsets and carry forwards, and those build to a total capital budget of $24,266,000. Then we have our sort of non-departmental expenditures, our pensions and insurance covered this evening already. State assessments, these are things that the state charges us, bundled into this, and making up the majority of this is our MBTA assessment, which is a little under $3.5 million. Our overlay reserve, which we had already covered, our FinCom reserve fund, and then our planned warrant articles. And so you'll see that they balance into our revenue number. Below that is our sort of our liquid assets. So these are money that Bill have for an emergency if we ever had to. They're essentially our savings, our free cash. Those total just under 24 million right now. A little bit of a new feature of this plan, as we were preparing for our ratings call, was to add some indicators, reserves as the percentage of the general fund, and then debt as a percentage of the general fund revenue, just to sort of track that through time. That gives you a sense of where we're at in FY 26. Puts it all sort of into one summarized column. If you look through the plan, next year in FY 27, we plan to use $5.2 million of override stabilization fund money, which would basically clear that account out, and it would still leave us with a deficit of $12.6 million. So we're staring at a large red number in FY 27. That number is very likely to come down. Best estimate, it would come down probably into the $8 or $9 million range for the deficit. But none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly how things are going to shake out through FY 25 as we approach 26, and then how 26 will go. So, and then, as I said earlier, as you work your way through the plan, if you look sort of along the bottom, the deficits grow each year. And that is a bit of a function of this plan in a sense, because things are amplified year over year, but the deficit, the trend is that the deficit is growing and that it is large. So that's sort of the rundown. I don't know what sort of questions we want to do on this tonight.
I think the only, if I could just add something, would be with respect to the assumptions for the out years, it is assuming the same rate of growth that is being applied from 25 to 26. So those commitment percentages made during the prior override, that's what's being shown here in the absence of, any additional information. It's like, hey, this is what it has been, so that's what it assumes throughout. And I would caution along the projected school enrollment growth, like that line across the bottom. The school department has agreed to, perhaps work with a consultant and do some other modeling to determine the accuracy of those figures to the best extent they can. Because for fiscal year 26, we have 115 students. I think in last year's plan, though I don't have it with me, we were expecting 3 students, right? That was a $1 million swing. So as you look at those other red numbers, until we have a high degree of feeling that they're accurate, these red numbers could be getting somewhat artificially depressed by the fact that the other red numbers along the bottom are commensurately reducing the budget each year. So there's a bit of a pendulum effect there that I just wanted to point out, that as I look at those numbers and the experience we just had presents to me some uncertainty, and I think, we have to work with the school department to try to revise those projections.
So this assumes that we will continue to allow a 3.25% growth on the town side and 3.5% growth on the
Gen
school
Ed,
side.
and it's 6.5 special education.
Rebecca, Chuck, Topher,
Alan.
Alan first. Alan.
Oh, thank you. Usually when you take a look at what you've got to do for an override over 3 years, you've got 3 deficits here, and under most circumstances, the quick and dirty, you're looking at a $20 million override. Now, if you take the free cash, which is set at 5.8 million, and you do what the manager suggests might be feasible, and you do a 5-year average instead of a 10-year average, you'd maybe increase that from 5.8 to 8.8 across that. That reduces the deficit from 20 million down to 17 million. That's an awful lot of money. It's about a 10% increase in taxes. We did that back in 2005, but back then it was like a $7 or $8 million override, not a $17 million override. Is it time to start looking at a lot of the assumptions going into the override next year? And number one, is there anything we could do this year to reduce the increase? And then maybe for next year, we start dropping some of the things. What if we go from 3.25 to 3 for the town? We go from 3.5 to 3 for the schools. We drop we drop these things down to make this a more palatable override for the citizens. Because if the override fails and each side's got to cut $7 or $8 million out of their budget, that would be catastrophic. Do we need to start looking at these assumptions like tomorrow? So that's my suggestion or thought.
Thank you, Al.
Chuck, Rebecca, Topher, Charlie, Alan, Paul.
Close me. I'm sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just looked at the spreadsheet, and I noticed we talked about health insurance earlier, that's going up 10% roughly this year.
Yep.
But then in the next, 4 years, we have it going up 5, 4, 4, 5. It doesn't seem like a conservative assumption, even if you're doing the rolling 5 or rolling 10, given what we know, what you've seen, like you said, in the past 2 years. So is that conservative enough on the insurance side?
Yeah, we carry, so how we project out insurance deep into the future is we carry 5.5% for each year beyond the next immediate year. It has worked well enough in the past. I think that if we run into another year of over 5.5, that we would want to really consider raising that, but previous years, FY 20, I think 2, 3, and 4, it came in well under that. So I don't know that we want to project a higher number yet on that, but I think it's warrants having a little pin in it.
Right,
That makes sense.
so the 10% might be an anomaly then.
Well, yeah, last year, we were told to carry 8.5 and it came in just over that. This year, we were told to carry 10 to 12. We think it'll probably come in somewhere 10. Once it is blended with all of our actual, apply it to our Medicare rates, hopefully it's less than that 10. But we'll see, but we're carrying a 10% growth figure right now.
Okay, thank you. And then on the school forecasting model, I mean, that's like, you know, like Bob Eugen just died, that's just a bit outside, right? So I guess this consultant's gonna diagnose that.
Yeah, so
Why is
how-
115? I mean, that's a huge
it's a
miss.
huge swing. It's a huge miss. That number 3, the previous projection was based on stale data, but it was the most recent that we had. I think it was from 2021. But they look at a whole world of data, which includes birth rates and bubbles moving through schools and all of this, things that are very complicated in my opinion. And they spit out what they think is the most likely model for when students are going to enter kindergarten and when students are going to graduate high school and all of the whole blob of students moving.
But it came out wrong.
No, hold on.
Yeah. The move-ins is what cannot be predicted.
Correct.
At all, right? There's no birth rate, they show up and then you do a town census and you're like, oh, now we have data, but they've already enrolled in school, so it's the move-ins that you like, there is no predictive modeling, I think, in that respect. Like, I look in, right, will work with the building inspector and I inquire like, hey, how much more square footage or how many seats or COs have we given to childcare facilities? Because I've been noticing if you drive up Mass Ave or Lowell Street, it's like the Little Kids Academy, Children's Center, the Mandarin preschool is now taken over.
Right.
4 preschool spots,
They're
like,
all over the sidewalk, they keep marching around.
right, like Elizabeth Daycare, oh, they just did an addition off the back. Springboard just renovated their entire basement. I'm looking like, we're literally exponentially adding childcare seats at the lowest ages, right? Like, so I think you can look at that, you can look at your birth rate and project what's coming through. Where I think it's always gonna be a miss is just move-ins.
Just one more, just a comment, it's a structural deficit. We have to start looking at the structure of the way we organize, which is related to my facilities question that I sent you, a shared service. I think we need to start looking across departments and figuring out what type of synergies we can get for consolidating common functions. Given these numbers are huge. So I'll just add that as a suggestion.
Thanks.
Rebecca?
Thank you. This is more questions along the line of this enrollment, growth and lack of good projections. When they do the next study, would the school department be expected to fund that?
Yes.
Okay, and can you remind me, like this last good one we had them was like McKibben's ballpark, what are those costs?
I honestly don't know.
Okay, but they may put it in this year's budget, would you expect?
They may already be working on it, so I know they do, there's usually 3 different forecasts, right? There's a consultant, there's an internal projection, and then perhaps one other, and they sort of, I don't know if they average them, I haven't been through that process, but supposedly, I think it's currently underway, I don't know with a consultant, or if they're just doing more robust, internal modeling at this point, but.
Do you have a sense, or is it better to ask them about where these kids are in terms of age? And for example, are any of them kids that are no longer, like, fewer kids are enrolling in Minuteman and more going to Arlington High, or do you know?
I think enrollment questions would best be directed to the superintendent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Just a couple questions here. CDBG is not in this, am I right about that?
You're right.
Okay. One, and this is another comment. go to the second page of what you put out, the PDF, it has,
Oh, could you speak up more?
yeah. The second page of the PDF has the legend. And I noticed that that wasn't in the budget book. And I'm not sure if it goes into the report to town meeting, but it would be very helpful, I think, I know it's hard to, it's small font, but it really explains a lot. And I think it would help.
I can email it out. Yeah.
When you say it would be helpful if we include it in the report to town meeting.
Yeah, like, and then, you know, it was in the budget book, I mean, we have the PDF here, we already have
Yeah,
it.
you have it.
But
It's our report, meeting includes the,
Yeah.
so it's our responsibility.
That's a good point.
Paul, did you have a question?
Two things. One is, you thought that this $12 million for FY 2027 is probably an overestimate. What areas do you think will affect that?
So this is, what this assumes is that we will spend every dollar that we appropriate, and that we will only collect what we budget for revenue. So we know that we're likely to beat some of our revenue projections, because we project them conservatively to make sure we don't miss on them. It'd be a disaster if we did. So those two things bucket.
The best line to look at is the free cash. So you'd be projecting in 27 to use 5.8 million. And would be 50% of what you expect to have, and that's 5.8 is 50% of what, 11 something. But our free cash figures are, like, starts the year at 10 million. You know your free cash usage number is gonna go up based on that.
My other question, I guess the answer, is there any allowance for MBTA communities in the guesses going forward?
We even model new growth conservatively. I mentioned we're capturing 850,000 this year. There's only, to my knowledge, been one MBTA communities project permitted, and that would be part of the growth. I am hopeful that we'll actually approach 1.4 or 1.5 million in new growth in the current fiscal year, so we would expect a surplus there. We are starting to see an increase in ADU activity, and with the state's overriding law that will sort of nullify our bylaw on or about February 3rd, allowing them by right, I think that we're, inspectional services is already hearing from some builders that as they look to, potentially construct 2-family homes, about maybe putting an ADU on one or the other. So I think that is going to be another unique thing that we don't have a ton of experience with yet, but it could be an opportunity for some new growth for the town. Like my fear is you look out perhaps 10 years, and I apologize, I don't have the numbers with me, is a lot of our new growth is generated from condoization, but I think we're down to under 203 families left, right? That portfolio of properties that were ripe for condoization that generate a good amount of our growth, they may not be there 10 years from now. Just at the rate those things are happening in town.
And the ADUs, they're better than MBTA communities on average, I'm guessing, because they will bring school children. And not as many school children.
Maybe not.
Ellen.
Just, a lot of comments here about the long-range plan and the deficits and things. I know I've been able to find out a lot about how this all works by going into the spreadsheet and playing with stuff, playing with the assumptions and numbers. So my annual request is, could you provide us with a copy of the Excel file so that everybody can play with it and see what the impact is of various assumptions, and put up on the SharePoint read-only, download it, don't change the common one or whatever. But it's a lot of fun to go in there and play with the percentages and assumptions.
Watch it ripple.
Watch it ripple, because it ripples through the whole thing. It's a complicated spreadsheet. You can tweak, change the 3 1/4 to 3.1 and see how that impacts it. It's very interesting. So we can get to it.
Gotta know the right place to change it, Don.
Charlie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I don't know if you can answer this question, Jim or Alex, but am I reading this correctly that, the fiscal 27 general education increase is 5.25% versus 3.75% in fiscal 26? Now, that's means we're, growing the school budget almost 1.5 times or twice the rate in 27, which is a year where we have projected a drop, and I'm talking about the general education budget, a year where we're projecting fewer students and a huge deficit. I'm just wondering what the long-range planning committee was thinking about when they did that.
Yeah, I'll just answer to that 5.25%. It adds that $600,000 to the general ed, which is why that's growing above the 3.5%, which is like the sort of.
Well, you had 1.7 million in the prior year, and it's 3.75%.
Well, that's because the year before that, FY 25, it was a 3.1 million addition. So it sort of muted the impact of that 1.7.
So if you took the 500,000 out, you're saying it would be 3.75?
If you took the 600,000 out, it would be 3.5.
Okay, thank you.
So you have the spreadsheet, you'd see that.
Jen?
Oh, yeah, just be very quick, but I was there during all the McKibben discussions. So I think I'll do an analysis soon, but we are not seeing elementary school enrollment grow anymore. What McKibben didn't do, he looked at how many kids were born here, how many 75-year-olds live here, stuff like that. They didn't really calculate the effect of a new high school. And what we're seeing is movement at the high school and middle school level. So that wasn't part of that calculation back then. Because that's where the growth is now. It's a high school, middle school, it's not elementary school, so.
Dean?
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer said what I was supposed to say. If you have the DESI website, you just Google it, you get school enrollment for the town of Arlington, you get it last year, you get it this year, right? And you just put on top of each other, and then you just ladder change people year over year, right? So I had done it earlier, I just did it again. So like, if you just compare year over year kindergarten classes last year for this year, we had 12 kids. That doesn't matter, right? That's not a projection issue. And then if you start tracking like grades as they move, right? The kindergartens that went to first grade, no net change. The first grades that went to second grade, no net change. In order to get to net change, you need to move to sophomores. 12 kids got added to the sophomore class, 14 kids came to the junior class, 20 came to the senior class. Like it just right up, right? Now that could be anything. That could be visas. That could we haven't met with them yet, so we don't. But my point is, it wasn't a projection miss, right? Because it wasn't like they were like, hey, we think it was 300 kindergartners and 420 showed up. It's like we thought it was an incremental miss at the bottom. Where it exploded was as you went through the pipeline. And that is not a trend that's ever lied. We've never seen it go up broad-based across grades. We did once, 2020, see it go down broad-based across grades. So it's a bizarre phenomenon. I know they're looking at it. I don't know if you had heard them talk about it all. I have.
They definitely talked about it in terms of the new high school.
Yeah.
John?
And just one comment, I actually did exactly what you said, and one thing that kind of jumps out at me, so first of all, 68 additional students at the high school, but then the weird thing is you get 61 additional students at Gibbs, even though Audison is kind of flatlining, like Gibbs is only one grade, I don't know how they get 61 additional students.
There was a big bulge.
Just for that one grade, yeah?
Yeah, there was a huge bulge that happened in certain big moving groups.
That almost matches the high school increase of 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, that bulge will keep moving through and it won't be as bad.
Yeah, I mean, seems like a big number for Gibbs, but it's.
But that was a big number in second grade 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Any other questions on long range plan? Any other questions for the town manager or deputy? I have a couple. Could you and I talked about celebrations, budget going up. Want to just tell everyone why that is going up?
So received a request through the select board via the Friends of Robbins Farm Park to see if the town would support and absorb the cost of putting up and providing that large screen for to show the Boston Pops, like the Independence Day celebration. And it was a modest amount of money, and as I evaluated that request, I looked at it as really something that we should be contracting with the vendor for and should be accepting the liability of, and agree that that was, really a magnificent town event that was really well attended and grown over the years. And that if a friends group had sort of made happen and supported over the years, that was sort of the one area where they had requested an offset, and it seemed reasonable because it was at a town asset and benefited a lot of townspeople. So that title we changed to incorporate Independence Day as well, and I think maybe added roughly $1,300, and it was for that very specific item for that event.
Any questions on that? Prudent investor guidelines, what does that say?
So the treasurer has a rough draft of a new investment policy. We're hoping to reconcile that. I don't know if this committee knows, but we also received a community compact grant to draw up a formal set of financial policies and practices. So that process is about to get underway, and we were just assigned our representative from the Collins Center to help navigate that process and set up sort of what this process is going to look like, who's going to be on the team, who's going to review things. But one of the ones we asked for assistance with first is, what model investment policies could they provide the town so that we could get access to those as well and reconcile them with, as we saw last year, we had a few different policies floating around. Sort of they had been consolidated into one. We want to fact check it against something that is being provided by the consultant. So timeline is that should happen in the month of February. Then that sort of more polished draft would be circulated in March. It has to go before the library trustees, cemetery commissioners, and the board of trust fund commissioners. And then, as we discussed last year, find a mechanism, if possible, to have a few interested parties from perhaps this committee help weigh in. And once we have the finalized policy, we're going to incorporate that into our request for proposals that would go out in April. There's really only 2 or 3 people in the municipal investing space now, so we'll be able to identify them. We expect them to submit their proposals, and then again, we would hope to have representation from all of the involved parties to participate in the interview, review the proposals so we can select a new investment consultant, and their contract would be effective for July 1, and that's when that new investment policy would go into effect, whether it be with our existing investment manager, or if based on the proposals that we got, that we were to but just ask if it was possible, if we could identify folks who may want to participate in that review and process. That would be helpful to think about now.
Questions? Any other topics you would like to bring to the town manager's attention? Any questions you might have? Alan?
Well, I just say, since we have, almost 15 minutes, are there any further questions about the cyber crime incident or the planning going forward? This would be a good time to ask. Sorry, Jim.
Alan and I have talked about this ad nauseum, so.
Doesn't seem like.
Well, I hope this is the way town meeting responds.
I'm tired. Charlie?
I have the same question I asked Monday night, and that is, where was the human error in this, and what are we doing about it?
Well, there were multiple human errors. that occurred in different locations. And I think what we've done to correct for some of those human errors is establish policies that clearly assign the actions that someone should take, and it defines who the person is that should take those actions. So that is the mechanism to try to, I suppose, create accountability.
So Powers and Sullivan never identified those missing controls in the past?
Not that I'm aware of.
And my understanding is that they every year review the decision process in the financial arena. And if there are missing steps, they're supposed to be reporting that in the management letter, and then it gets corrected the following year. And we're paying, $75,000 or $100,000 a year or something like that to get that done.
Agreed. What I would say that I've not personally reviewed, management letters from years prior to know definitively whether something specific had been identified and then went uncorrected. I would have to do some research to.
Well, I can tell you, because I've been on the audit review committee for quite a while, there were probably 6-7 years ago, there were issues more about sort of physical security of the IT, the servers being flooded and things like that, and those were all corrected. I think for the last 3-4 years, the management letter's been almost empty.
So maybe we should get
they're all in line.
New auditor.
Well, you could talk about what CBIZ did this year as far as reviewing, and I don't know if they have plans to do that on an annual basis.
So CBIZ, so it was Powers and Sullivan. Powers and Sullivan got swallowed up by Markham. Before we even inked something with Markham was swallowed up by CBIZ. So when we went through the audit this year, of course, we made them, rightfully so, aware of what occurred and asked that they, pay attention and help us review the incident to get yet another set of eyes on it. And they are a large enough company where they actually have an IT team, and they set up a separate call with one of their IT professionals that we pulled our IT team into, so that they could ask questions of the IT team and better understand what happened and make sure that the controls that were either being implemented or being contemplated for implementation were sufficient. And this is, taking that a step further, what I've discussed with Alan is, I feel very confident in the steps and measures we've taken to protect us against a future business email compromise. What keeps me awake at night is that is not the only risk out there. There are risks that I certainly don't understand, and while we invest in some tools, at some point they won't have kept up with the threat actors, right? Like they use AI and they learn and they stay ahead of some things, but right, what is that threat that we don't know about that we're not preparing for? Like what we did was sort of a retrospective look, and what we've talked about is like, how do we project what some of those risks are? It's good to close up a gap after it's already happened, but really we need to think about, whether it be ransomware or other things that could occur, and how do we proactively address those potential, breaches or whatever it may be.
Annie,
No, I didn't.
Chuck?
Yeah, just a couple of questions, Jim. So we have yet to talk to the CIO. We have her this week. In that conversation, if she has a perspective that she can pull in certain tools and technologies to help reduce our risk, I'm assuming we're open to budget modifications to make that happen if we think the risk reduction is, right? So easy answer there. The other thing I'll say is, this auditor, you kind of alluded to this, it's a probably very broad-based audit. Having an explicit cyber-focused audit each year is probably a worthwhile investment, just from a risk reductions perspective. It's whatever, 80, 100K. But it also help educate our IT department as to what controls, they should plan for. The last thing I'll say is that it's not just about the tools. I think that there's significant probably process changes that could happen, similar to what happened in the finance process that was related to the breach. I think we could look inside the IT processes, the cyber processes, and probably find some things too,
I agree. And
which is not a budgetary item.
right, and I think that, I'm hoping to learn more, and I will be totally upfront. I am not necessarily, I have very limited technical expertise, and this is something that I, relied on folks in this room to help educate me on some things, but, we're grateful that the Office of Municipal and School Technology has agreed to sort of conduct a penetration test of our community and help sort of put some additional stress to see, like, because, there's a lot of acronyms and I can look at screens with a lot of moving things. I don't know necessarily where we're at risk, and I, have been welcoming, encouraging our IT department to, like, let's get every tool and resource available to us, right? Like, there's a new municipality every week that's being targeted. Last week it was Bourne, and their 911 network was down, right? Like, it's always gonna be something. So if the Commonwealth is collecting that information and learning from those things, like, let's bring them in here, see what testing they can do for us to identify other potential, risks. And I'm just trying to, like, spread the message. Like, shouldn't be like, worried, like, I'm trying to not put fear in the IT. Like, we should want to know where our risks are and where there may be exposures so we can close them. Like, don't be fearful of us having someone else look because they might find something. It's like, we want to find something.
Transparency, I agree.
Right, like, it's changing the mindset of, like, oh, no, we're good.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
So one thing is, when we do things well, nobody notices, right? And we've had some successes. I know we had a attack on our system that with a ransom, and we had backup, and so we didn't pay the ransom. So it's great, but no one heard about it, right?
Mhm.
So we've done some things well. But my most important sort of point I want to raise is we need to know what other towns are doing. So when we go to town meeting, if there are a few towns who are doing this really well, like being able to say, these are what these towns are doing. They've hired an analyst, they've worked with this outside department. It's just, like, I look at this, I'm like, is that one analyst gonna be the right person? I don't know, right? But if we had some other models of other towns that have done this really well.
Josh,
Is there a change in, like, training or fishing probes and things like that you're implementing?
So we implemented the first time ever, and it was, again, with the help of the Commonwealth, a mandatory cybersecurity awareness training for every user. It involved 3 hours of training. We just wrapped that up at the end of the calendar year. I certainly found that myself to be helpful. I think what we're noticing, though, is that that's a point in time. We trained everyone that was with us on those 3 hours. So one of the that we've invested in, and it's sort of a part of our email protection suite, sort of stays up on what the latest schemes and scams are and allows us to fish our own employees so that we can identify and get the statistic back, like, okay, here are all the people that clicked the link. Okay, and then be able to send some sort of remedial training, or, okay, here's a knowledge-based article on what it is that you've fallen for, and, like, here you fell for this one. What we haven't mapped out is, what do we do if someone continually, falls for these things? Like, at what point they're just kind of like, I'm pulling the plug here.
Yeah, that's companies.
Alan.
And we've talked about this, the last thing that keeps me awake is identity theft. And not even necessarily under our own control. Something happened at Power School, I'm not sure what happened or what got exposed. I pay my taxes, I'm still old enough, I pay my taxes online. And they have my bank account number, my credit card, all kind of history and like that. And what I've been talking to Jim about is, if a breach happens, it almost inevitably will, and there's some sort of identity theft or data theft, how does the town respond to it? Is it a reverse 911 call? Is it the town alert system? is it, do we offer training? Do we offer credit card protection, whatever? So I think that's another unanswered question.
Yeah, and I appreciate the questions you've been asking. We've been having, I've seen a lot of back and forth with our website vendor.
Yeah.
About like, what do we do if someone even just hijacks it and starts doing graffiti there or putting up, pornography on the homepage? Like, we can't pull the plug on it, right? It's being hosted
We're getting
elsewhere.
more and more dependent on third parties.
Right, and, understanding that even these, massive companies can't just send us a 1 or 2 pager right away that says like, here's our SOP. Usually what we're getting back is like, oh, we're not liable for anything, right? Like, they just take like this defensive posture. It's like,
Didn't you read the fine print?
I just wanna know what you're gonna do, who we can call, what we can expect for a response time, so that if someone like, how are you gonna prevent, bad actor access? Like, what can you do to help the town? It's good that we're starting to ask these questions because you've asked those questions of us. We're not always getting exactly the great answers that we would hope to get. So
keep asking.
Well, thank you. This has been very informative. I appreciate the time that you've spent with us. Yeah, and I think I'll entertain a motion to adjourn at this point.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.